I'd like to begin. Sorry. Hello. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that this event is taking place in the land of the Lachute-speaking Native tribes. This talk is also a part of the North Seattle College Art Gallery programming and is sponsored by NSE Student Leadership, so that you know that. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Seattle artist JulietShen. I was introduced to Juliet's work through the Duwamish Artist Residency. She has participated in this residency since 2012. There have been a number of shows of the work coming out of this residency, including one at our gallery here at North Seattle College about 5 years ago. I attended a lecture that she gave a couple of years ago at Studio E in Georgetown, and I was smitten. This is going to be a treat for you. Juliet had a 35-year career as a designer. She ran an independent graphic design firm in Seattle from 1989 to 2012. She is a typeface designer with a master's degree in typeface design from the University of Reading in England. Her work was included in Type is Beautiful, a story of 50 remarkable fonts by Simon Loxley, which was published last year in 2017. She designed a Lakshut seed font for the Tulalip tribe. Lakshut seed is the endangered language of the Puget Sound Native Americans. Her talk today, The Art in Letter Forms in My Art, will talk about the interconnections between her artwork and typeface design. Juliet taught at SVC, Seattle School of Visual Concepts, which is downtown here. Her artwork has been collected by the Tacoma Art Museum and the City of Seattle. Her work is included in the North Seattle College Art Gallery's current show, On the Other Hand, Text in Abstraction. And I invite you to join us in the gallery after this talk to look at the work, to mingle, and to ask Juliet additional questions. Thank you, and please give a kind round of applause for Juliet.
Thank you all for coming here, both the students and teachers who are kind of sharing their time together with me, and the people from the outside world who came. This talk is going to be, it's not going to be an art history survey of people who have used letter forms in their art. It's actually about how dealing with letter forms changes the way you see things and how that correspondingly affects the way you see things when you're making fine art. And so it's really about how these two areas came together in my life. I'm starting with this very kind of cryptic quote attributed to Eric Gill, who was a typeface designer, a sculptor, and an artist in the early 20th century. And he said, letters are things, not pictures of things. So let's kind of explore what he could have meant by that statement. He could have meant it very literally, because when he was making type, it was still cast in metal. There was no such thing as digital type. And while the process had been mechanized, it was still based on a process that basically had been around since the 15th century. And it was a very laborious process using hard, real materials. So the first step was to carve what we call a counterpunch. And you just take a piece of metal, thin piece of metal with a flat top. You carve the top until it's close to the shape you want. And the shape that you're trying to carve is not the letter that you're going to make. It's the space inside the letter that you're going to make. So that punch, which ended up being shaped like a little O, that counterpunch, I should say, is then punched into another piece of metal that's called the punch. And it makes a hole in that around which you carve out the letter, in this case, the letter N. So it's really the middle of the letter N that's designed first, and then the stroke is carved away around that hole. that punch essentially gets driven into another piece of metal called a matrix. And that matrix is put inside a type mold that's adjustable so that it can be made wider for bigger letters and narrower for narrow letters. And then molten alloy of lead is poured into that mold. And you can see from that last diagram on the right, on number 4, that when it's poured into the mold, the letter form is at the bottom. Then there's kind of a shoulder that's going to be the part of the type that sits on the press bed. Because when you're printing from metal type, all your type has to be exactly the same height. And then there's an extra little sort of fishtail that's going to be attached to it because you need to fill the mold past that shoulder. So the hot metal is shaken, and it's a special mixture that hardens very quickly. Then the mold is broken open, and the piece of type falls out with that extra little fishtail on it, which is then broken off and filed away so that the final piece of type is actually standing on those two shoulders. And there you see one with the letter S at the bottom. So type was really a thing when Eric Gill said that. But we're in the digital age where, you know, unless you're using letterpress mostly to make art, you're not actually printing with metal type anymore. You're printing with digital images of type. So what does a statement like that mean now? Did it become untrue? And my thesis, which I'd like to get you on board with today, is that no, it's still true, because this is a picture of a thing, right? It's a picture of a wine glass. And I can do this and haven't actually destroyed anything, right? Because it was a picture of a wine glass. But here's a wine glass with physical properties. And if I do the same thing with this wine glass, there's going to be all sorts of consequences. Next time I have dinner, I'll be one short, right? So what we need to do now in the digital age is to treat letters as if they were still things. And what does that mean? Well, suppose that you're designing a poster with a picture of Picasso on it. And on the left, we have the picture, but we don't have that much space for the poster, on the poster for it. So what should we do? Should we squeeze it digitally, like it is in the center, or should we crop it to the size that fits? And I think with Picasso's face, most of you would agree that you crop it to the size that fits. Now, all of you know that type is not treated that way. In the left, we have a typeface, Helvetica Neue Bold. In the middle, we have a typeface, the same typeface, that's just been squeezed digitally so it will fit in the image. And that happens all the time now. You see it cast in plastic and metal on the outsides of buildings. You see it in store signage. You see it on t-shirts and sweatshirts. I've actually thrown away t-shirts I found in my husband's drawer that had that kind of type on them. On the right is actually a condensed typeface that's designed from the beginning to take less space, but to look like it's the same style as the typeface on the left. So why do I object to the computerized condensing of type? Well, for one thing, it's not treating it like it's a thing, right? You couldn't do that when type was metal. You couldn't squeeze it, you couldn't distort it. And here's what happens when you distort it. On the left, you see it shows up mostly in the curved letters of a typeface, but you see the C and the S and the O of Picasso. And the x-axis, the horizontal axis, has been reduced to 75% of its original size. But the y-axis has been left at 100%. So what's happened is the computer has digitally removed pixels from the horizontal width of letters. And what that does is it distorts the curves, where now they're skinny on the side and they're fat on the top and bottom. Now this is supposed to be a monolinear typeface where everything's supposed to look like it's the same around, all the way around the letter. And on the right, you see how the type designer has actually made different design decisions based on the fact that the letter of that stroke weight had to take less width. Okay, so you don't see those distorted curves. You don't see this skinny right and left side of the S. The S has a nice strong spine all the way through it. And you don't see the C with a skinny vertical and fat tops. So there we're talking about letter forms themselves, but we also need to actually examine the space between letter forms and the space inside letter forms. So in order to get you to see the space inside letter forms a little differently, I'm going to take you to some sculptures by Giacometti, a Swiss sculptor, early 20th century, worked mostly in France. And this is one of his sculptures called City Square, or La Place. And I used to ask my students to tell me what these people were all doing in this city square at the same time. And if you go through that exercise in your mind, I think you'll find you can actually sort of come up with some ideas. Do they know each other? Did they mean to meet there? Did they just happen to be there at the same time? There's a degree of content in there that you wouldn't expect from a bunch of figures that are so distorted from reality, that are almost three-dimensional cartoon representations of the human figure. And I think that's because Giacometti was a master at controlling the negative space inside his figures. So he's shaping those spaces between the arms and the legs and between the various figures themselves very carefully, and he's not paying attention to the shape of the figures' bodies or to the surfaces of their bodies. The sculpture is all about those spaces in between things that define how we see this scene. So here's a single figure, his man walking, and it doesn't represent the proportions of a man at all, but I don't think anybody would have trouble recognizing it as a man walking. So you have to ask yourself, why is that? And if you look at the way he's crafted the spaces between the legs and the shape of those spaces and the space between the arm and the body, all of those things make us see a human being moving forward in space. And on the right, you have a more contemporary artist, Dwayne Hansen, who does extremely realistic life-size wax figures. So this figure is actually in the Wisconsin Museum of Art, and you see him just like that. He's all by himself against a big blank white wall. And even though I had used this sculpture in my lectures, when I walked into that museum and first saw it, I kind of did a double take. I didn't realize it wasn't a janitor standing there in front of an empty art wall. But I would pose to you that Dwayne Hansen has gotten the lesson from Giacometti about the shaping of the negative spaces within his sculptures. And that's one reason why his figures are so compelling. So how does this apply to letter forms? Well, there's a space inside letter forms. And on the left, I've left the space inside intact, and I've messed up the outline of the O. And on the right, I've messed up the space inside and left the outline as it is. And my question to you is, which one looks more wrong? And the one on the right. What matters to us most in letter forms is actually the shape of what's not there. Same experiment with an 8. The one on the left, the outside's messed up. The one on the right, the inside is messed up. So that's the space inside letter forms. How about the space outside letterforms and between letterforms and their neighbors. So here we have Giacometti's statue, Woman Standing. And let's say you have a gallery and you're hanging a portrait of Picasso next to this sculpture. You can hang it in a way that each of those pieces of art have enough space around them to feel like they can be seen as what they are, or you can hang it so close to the sculpture that it's invading the space that really belongs to the sculpture. So the perimeter of the sculpture, whatever shape that takes, actually has territorial claims around it. It has a certain amount of space around it that's needed for you to actually be able to see that sculpture for what it is. And if you invade that space by hanging that painting too close, you actually can't really study that sculpture. So this happens when you're setting type too. On the top you have letters that are set so far apart that they wouldn't necessarily form a word. In the middle, you have letters that are invading each other's space, especially the O and the W. Now you'll notice that they're not touching, the W and the O. But if you try to look at that W, it's pretty hard to see its form because it needs more space around it for its form to be understood. And at the bottom, every letter is given sort of its minimum amount of space to be comprehended as that letter. And it doesn't matter at this size with one word, but if you're talking about a lot of words at a smaller size, this is going to have a profound effect on the legibility of whatever you're typesetting. It happens with the space between letters as well. So here's a word that I purposely set with this typeface, Bembo, because it has this really difficult R with this tremendously long tail. And here's the way I would typeset it. So what am I trying to do? I'm actually trying to look like there's an equal amount of white space within and without each letter in that word. So if you look at the two, you'll notice that between the I and the R, where you have these parallel lines, it's darker in the word. So the color across the word goes light, dark, light. And if you look at the bottom word, it's a more even distribution of black and white, so it's a more even color across the word. Here's another one. So you can see the difference in color, in darkness and lightness across the word. That's dealing with what we call display type. And I'd like to talk about text, when you fill a whole letter, a whole page with text. And it's actually more difficult to get good spacing with capital letters because the way digital fonts are designed these days, they're spaced so that capital letters space well next to small case letters, lowercase letters, because that's when we mostly use them. So often with a font, if you type a bunch of capital letters, they will not be well spaced in that font. And in order to understand about the spacing between text, between large amounts of letters set in text, I want to look at another artist, and that's Giorgio Morandi. He, Italian artist. He lived in Bologna, and he's known for painting mainly still lifes his entire career, and they were mainly still lifes of the same set of objects over and over again. So they were all titled Natura Morta, still life, so I'm not going to give titles on the rest of the slides, but I'm going to give you the date of each picture. And these dates go forward in time until the year before his death. So just kind of take note of the date at the top of each picture. Now this is 1962. Remember, he lived until 1964. And what I'd like to suggest to you is that he could make a whole career out of painting these same objects, because the paintings weren't about the objects. The paintings were about what happened when he grouped the objects and created different kinds of space and relationship between the objects. And if that's what you're painting, all you have to do is move something, and it's a new thing to paint. So you're not painting the same thing over and over again. (1963), the year before he died, and I like to think that he finally just painted what he had been seeing all along, the spaces between things. Okay, so how does that relate to type? Well, when you set type in text, you're dealing with black and white, right? So what I've done is, on the left you have Helvetica, okay? On the right you have the same typeface, but I've added 30 units of tracking, which means simply that there's a little bit of extra space between every letter and its neighbor. Okay. So what I've done really is added a little bit of white space into every single word. And if you look at that, you can see that the paragraph on the right is lighter on the page, a lighter shade of gray on the page than the one on the left. So here I've taken that same bit of text that was on the right before, and I've added additional space between each line. And you can see again that it's gotten even lighter on the page. So when you are setting text, you control the color of that text on the page by how much space you have between each letter and its neighbor, and between each line and the next line. And in order to control that ratio of black on white on the page, type designers actually do something to letter forms. On the left you see a W that's made by putting two V's together. And it's technically proper, all the strokes are the same weight. But there's sort of a really dark area on the left side, in the letter on the left side, in the center, where the strokes come together. And if you have a W like that in a typeface, when you set it on a page of text, every time that letter appears on the page, it's going to be a dark spot. So instead of getting this kind of evenly interwoven color of text, you're going to get spot here, spot there, spot there, spot there. So what type designers do is they go in and they carve out some of that space, and you don't see that little carve out when it's set as text, but it adds a little white inside the letter so that it will be the right color on the page. So I'm going to show you some of my artwork, kind of explain what was going through my head, and you'll probably be able to put two and two together and figure out how all this information about typography plays into it. These are the drawings that I did 1 year on the Duwamish residency, so they were all done in place. Some of them are done inside a steam plant, some of them are done on the river, but in a lot of the cases I pre-printed some letter forms on my drawing paper and took that drawing paper outside with me. So this was inside the old Georgetown steam plant, which is of course decommissioned, and it's an incredible, tall atrium space with huge pipes and turbines and machines all over the place. Now, I am a person who relates to landscape space. I don't like to draw machines. I don't even like to draw chairs and tables. I really, kind of don't like to draw things that have been constructed. And so, in this case, I'm using my letter forms to bring a kind of mechanistic element into my drawings so that I can mess around that mechanistic element. The reason this has an orange and green pattern in the printing is That particular year we did a visit, the residency did a visit to the recycling plant, and you know those lime green trucks that go around for recycling? That was more or less their color scheme. So I went back and I printed some type in my studio with that color scheme, and then I used that as drawing paper on the river. And so here, remember, I start with a piece of paper with those 3 letter forms printed on it and nothing else. We were sitting under the First Avenue South Bridge with a beautiful view of Mount Rainier looking south down the river. And then on my left, there were a bunch of buildings, parking lots, machines, all this mechanical stuff sort of obscuring the landscape. So I just more or less decided those letter forms were going to be all that stuff that I don't like to draw. And I drew the stuff I like to draw around it. This was drawn looking at a bunch of containers on the shore, and I kind of was really interested in the sky. So the containers sort of make a little appearance in there. This is the series of drawings that is in the gallery now. And they were all made by printing metal type on drawing paper before I drew on it. And that metal type is a font called OCR-A that was actually cast in about 1960 or so. And it was used for the first machines that were able to mechanically read numbers and types. So this is in the days before it was easy for computers to decipher type and numerals. And they still use these numerals on the bottom of your checks if you look at them. So this is kind of just a raking view detail showing what the surface of those drawings are like. And they are all based on my memories of landscape spaces that I've sketched in.
Again, with these, you're printing first and painting after.
I'm printing first, and then I'm painting on top of the print with brush and ink.
And what media are you using for the painting?
The painting is done with carbon black hydrous ink, and so that's a pigmented ink. It's not a dye ink. If any of you are. Well, a lot of you are artists, but basically, you know, dye inks are fugitive, so you want to be careful how much you use dye inks, but pigmented inks are as light fast as possible, and that's why I use, and I don't use, by the way, I don't use India ink or Chinese ink because I don't like to ruin my brushes, so this way I could go out sketching and leave the ink in my brush and it would wash out, but if you use a waterproof ink, like India ink or Chinese ink, it's got lacquer in it and it's going to ruin your brushes if you don't clean them right away. So the next series of prints is done the same way. They're drawings over prints made from the same typeface that I happen to own, in that metal typeface. But I was doing them in 2014 when the OSO slide occurred. And so that profoundly affected the direction that suite of prints went. There's 6 of them, and you'll see they sort of, what I tried to do in each print, and I think there's 2 of them in the show because the other 4 have been sold, but what I tried to do in the prints is have both a naturalistic and a mechanical element, because those 2 things played a part in the slide, and then I tried to show sort of a progression of destruction, if you will.
What are you doing to get this to smear? Do you have the typeface and you rub the paper across it, or are you rubbing the...
I just move the typeface on my press. You know, the whole thing of putting the typeface on the paper was very random. You know, I just had that type on my press. I have a Vandercook letterpress, and I would just move it around, twist it, and then run another piece of paper through the press. So I ended up with a stack of papers with all different patterns on them. And the way that I work is I just kind of put them up and stare at them until I see something in them, and then I try to draw the thing that I'm seeing. Yeah, so the next set of paintings I'd like to show you was in a show in 2015 of my work. The show was called Literal. There's your definition for what a literal is. And that's a picture of Willapa Bay over on the Long Beach Peninsula, where I had an artist residency. And I really got into staring at the mud that was left in the bay after the water receded, and looking at the sand after the tide went out and stuff. So it's, you know, it's kind of all about, these paintings are all about looking downwards, actually. So I'm going to show you each painting and a detail of it on the right so that you can see the brushstrokes. And here, there's no letter forms, but ever since those early drawings that I did, I have been working with a small brush, no matter what size paper I'm working on. So in essence, it's almost like I'm creating my own typographic background there. That's just the way I work now, because I'm used to seeing form come out of a mass of detail. I'll let you read that definition for a moment. So, I learned the meaning of this word from reading some newspaper articles. I like to read the articles of Linda Mapes in the Seattle Times. They're always very interesting stories about environmental things that are going on, and they always include enough science to become really intriguing. And when I started to think of water, and I've been painting a lot of water, as having an area at the bottom where these tiny little microbes would begin to form life forms, which would then sort of end up in the water and be taken somewhere else. I got really excited because I felt it was like it was the same process that goes on when you're setting type. That might sound a little crazy, but that's the way I felt. There was a direct correspondence between hyporeic zones and typesetting. And so this is the story that was in the Seattle Times about Thornton Creek. And they actually went to some side branches of the Cedar River and, took these like big tubes and sucked some of the material out of those stream bottoms, and then took it over to Thornton Creek, which had been dead and had been just restored, and they injected that stuff under rocks and stuff in Thornton Creek to try and get it populated with living microbes again. And I thought, okay, little things have big consequences. And I think of these two paintings really as almost like core samples done through a hyporeic zone. So I'm going to go back and talk about two typefaces I worked on very briefly. One was to do the Latin letters for an Arabic typeface, and the second one is the Lachute seed typeface, which I'll talk a little bit longer about. So this is a sampling of an Arabic typeface that I was invited to design the Latin letters for. And the Latin letters are simply our normal ABCs with additional accents and everything that are used in a lot of European languages. So imagine trying to design something with our alphabet that would be compatible with this alphabet. So never mind that it reads right to left instead of left to right, and that it's got connections along the baseline, which we don't have between our letters, but also, the shapes are really different. I mean, this is a language that developed its typefaces based on a calligraphic model. So the goal was to create a Latin typeface that, when set next to this Arabic typeface, looked equal in importance. So we didn't want either one to be more important. We wanted them to harmonize and look like they were equal partners in bilingual typesetting. And it turned out the way to do that was text color, what I was talking to you about when I showed you those samples of Helvetica and how they get lighter and darker. And so the Latin letter forms had to be designed so that the ratio of black and white in the letter forms would match the ratios of black and white in the Arabic letter forms, so that when they were typeset next to each other at the same type size, they would be equal in color. And this is a sampling of the different weights that we created for the typeface to show how the Latin and the Arabic are as close as we could make them in text color on the page. Now, Arabic has had hundreds of years of development as in calligraphy before it was ever typeset in metal, and the same is true of our Latin alphabet. So on the left you see a manuscript from Florence from the year 1475. So that's handwritten, okay? It's in a type of calligraphy that emerged from the Middle Ages into early Renaissance called a humanist script. And it's actually the kind of handwriting that the early designers of metal type for printing in the West copied for their printing forms. So on the right you see a book printed 5 years later in Venice, and you can see that it's based on the same letter forms as the one on the left. So when you're writing something for centuries, you're creating manuscripts, the human hand is automatically going to make little changes in those letter forms so that they fit together better, so that one doesn't bump into the other. The whole thing ends up being this beautifully woven fabric because it's had centuries of refinement by the human hand, and that was copied into metal type by the early printers. The Lashutseed typeface didn't come into existence until the mid-1960s. And that's because Lashutseed was an oral tradition until that point. It had never been written down. In the 1960s, a man at the University of Washington called Thomas Hess, who was a linguist, went up to the Tulalip Reservation and started knocking on doors and trying to find native speakers with whom he could study so that he could eventually create a written script for the language. And that might sound like a simple thing to do, but it was a very, very difficult task because the language was classified officially as being on the verge of extinction at that point. And in the preceding generation, children had been taken away from their families and sent to boarding schools, and they were forbidden to speak their language at the boarding school. So you had an entire generation and a half of children who went through this traumatic experience, and when they eventually were able to reunite with their families, they tried to protect their children by not speaking the language to them, because the consequences had been so severe to them for speaking the language. And I don't know if you have your own story that will allow you to relate to this, but I grew up in the 1950s. My parents came over from China after the war, and I was growing up during the McCarthy era, when anybody who had come from a communist country was very suspect. And so I never discuss politics with anybody. I don't like to wear t-shirts with political slogans. I just do not discuss politics. And that's because my parents protected me by not bringing politics into our home. So it was the same in these homes where the language was not spoken. And at this point, there are very few elders left who actually spoke Lashutseed as a first language. But the language is definitely being revived, and everybody who's speaking it now is learning it as a second language. So when I was hired by the Tulalip tribes to design a font, it was to replace this font that you're looking at here. And it was very clear to me in talking to the language teachers that the survival of the language depended on the willingness of young people to learn the language as a second language. And I didn't think that they would be attracted to learning a language that looked like this when it was written. It sort of is, to me, is very intimidating. I've been told it looks like chemical formulas or something. So, and by the way, this is basically a version of Times Roman that was opened up, and the letters they needed for the Lashutseed writing were put into it. So I decided to try and base my letter forms on traditional Salish art. And my goal was to make the typeface look like it was indigenous. In other words, the spoken language was indigenous. If you ever have the pleasure of hearing it spoken, you'll realize that it's a language that would be very camouflaged if you spoke it in the woods and the shores of the Pacific Northwest. It has a lot of natural sounds in it that seem to come from nature. So the language itself sounds totally indigenous. It sounds like it grew out of this landscape. And I wanted to make a typeface that didn't look like it was actually imposed on the language later. I wanted it to look like it came from the same landscape. And I was very lucky because at the time I was designing this, there was a show at Seattle Art Museum about Salish art, and I went to see the show, and I got to see a lot of traditional pieces of art. So I'm going to show you some of the pieces that were really significant in helping me choose the letter forms of the font. And in this case, I decided to make my round letters be this kind of wide, flat circle instead of a tall oval or a geometric circle, as it is in most typefaces. This piece of art on the top should actually be vertical, but I put it horizontally so you could see it larger. It's part of a house post. But hopefully you can kind of see where I was inspired by the shapes in that art. So this is the typeface set in the same text that I showed you in Times Roman earlier. And on the right, you just see an enlargement of it, so you can see how the text fits. So I was trying, to do that aesthetic thing of making it look like it belonged with the spoken language, but I also was working on the texture it would make on the page when it was typeset. This is one of the few Lashute words I can actually pronounce. Teiguiseed. Thank you. I guess we can have some questions if anybody. Yes?
You said that you used font to showcase mechanical objects when this goes in the landscape. Why do you think font is good for that?
Because they're mechanically produced and they're geometrical, whereas nothing in nature is actually, nothing in nature has a straight line unless it was built by man, right? And nothing in nature is perfectly symmetrical unless it was built by man. So I was sort of substituting those letter forms because they had those same qualities as the buildings I just don't engage with too well. Yes?
When did it kind of hit you that typography was most interesting?
I'm sorry, could you just say that a little louder?
When in life did you realize that
Typography? That's an interesting question. It was very late in life. I started out actually wanting to be a fine artist, and then I had the need to earn a living, and I became a graphic designer. And I had been in business, for at least 25 years before I went back to school and got a master's in typeface design. And the reason was that in everything you do in graphic design, the one area that I found had the most depth of knowledge underpinning it was typography. Okay, yes?
The Willow Bay project.
Yeah.
Were those paintings done in plein air, out in the?
No, they're all done in the studio. Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, that residency was wonderful because I had a studio and then I had the outdoors right outside my door, so I could just go for these long walks, come back to the studio and work immediately in the studio. Yeah, it was ideal. Yes?
How long have you been sketching landscapes? Or when did that arise?
Well, I didn't start doing art again until 2012. Up until that time, when I was doing graphic design, I pretty much stayed away from sketching. Yeah. Yes?
The back, I've read all the Harry Potter books, and in the back they always say that they had a typeface design, and I never understood, well, why would you just design a typeface?
Yeah.
But that explains it, the look of each page. The fact there's thousands of typefaces.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you just go away from this lecture kind of seeing type more than you used to see, I'll be very happy, because most people just sort of just ignore the type and are reading the words. And there'll be less abuse of letter forms in our environment if more people actually see the type. Thank you.
Thank you very much.